JonBenét's family now hoping that, plus renewed public interest and new DNA technology, might finally help close this case.
It was the morning after Christmas. The tree was still standing. The presents were still scattered across the floor. The house still carried the smell of the night before, warmth, food, the particular quiet of a family at rest. And somewhere inside that house, somewhere in the place a child was supposed to be safest in the entire world, a 6-year-old girl was gone. JonBenét Ramsey. Her name carries weight in a way that few names do, not because of anything she chose, not because of anything she built, but because of what was done to her, and because of everything that came after. The investigation that stumbled almost from its first hour. The evidence that was compromised before it was even fully understood. The suspects who were named in headlines and then cleared. The parents who were tried in the court of public opinion for years, before anyone had a single confirmed answer. The case that was supposed to resolve itself in days, and instead became one of the longest open wounds in American criminal history. She was 6 years old. She wore crowns. She danced in sequins under stage lights that were too large and too bright for her small frame, and she looked completely at home in them. She had a smile that photographs strained to contain. And on the night of December 25, 1996, in a house in Boulder, Colorado, someone took her life. The details of what happened to JonBenét have been examined and re-examined for nearly 30 years. Books have been written. Documentaries have been made. Grand juries have convened and deliberated and still not produced a conviction. Experts have disagreed. Investigators have changed their minds. And through all of it, no one has been charged. No one has been held accountable. No official conclusion has been reached. But the evidence that exists, the investigative record that stretches across nearly 3 decades, and the forensic science that has continued to evolve, long after the original investigation faltered, together they tell a story. Not a finished one, but a haunting one. One that raises questions so specific and so persistent that they refuse to be put aside. This is that story. Boulder, Colorado in 1996 was a particular kind of American city, comfortable, prosperous, the kind of place where people built beautiful lives inside beautiful homes and had very little reason to expect that those lives could come apart in a single night. It was not a city accustomed to the kind of horror that arrived on December 26th of that year. And it was not a police department that was prepared, in training, in resources, or in experience, for what that horror would demand of them. The Ramsey family was prominent in Boulder. John Ramsey had built something real. He was the founder and CEO of Access Graphics, a technology company that reached $1 billion in annual revenue in the very same year. His youngest daughter was murdered. Patsy Ramsey was a former beauty queen, Miss West Virginia 1977, who had taken her own pageant history and poured it into a devoted involvement in her daughter's performances. From the outside, theirs was a life that appeared to be working in exactly the way such lives are supposed to work. Beautiful home, successful career, a family that seemed close and warm and rooted. They had 2 children together, Burke, who was 9 years old that December, and JonBenét, who had turned 6 that summer. John had children from a previous marriage as well. The family was layered, as families often are, but by most accounts it was also genuinely loving. JonBenét had been participating in child beauty pageants since she was very young. The world she performed in was elaborate and highly produced, specific costumes, rehearsed routines, the kind of polish and presentation that transformed small children into something that looked, at least on a stage, much older and more finished than they were. For her parents, those performances appeared to be a source of real pride and real joy. And for JonBenét herself, by the accounts of people who knew her and watched her perform, she was a child who genuinely came alive on a stage. She was energetic. She was confident. She had an ease in front of an audience that most adults would envy. She loved it, or at least she looked like she loved it, which in the end may be all that matters. She was deeply loved. She was also, because of those performances and the photographs and footage that came from them, unusually visible for a 6-year-old. After her death, that imagery circulated everywhere, across newspapers and television screens and magazine covers. and it gave the public a face that made the tragedy feel immediate in a way that crimes involving children often do. That visibility would shape everything about how the case was discussed, covered, and remembered, in ways that were sometimes more about spectacle than about her. The night of December 25th began the way those nights do. The Ramseys attended a Christmas party at the home of friends. JonBenét fell asleep in the car on the ride home. She was carried inside. Patsy put her to bed. The house settled into its late-night quiet, and somewhere in the hours that followed, in the stillness that should have been safe, something happened that has never been fully explained. The next morning, Patsy Ramsey found a ransom note on the kitchen stairs, 3 pages, handwritten, demanding $118,000, a figure that matched, almost to the dollar, John Ramsey's annual bonus. She called 911, and the investigation that would define the next 30 years of American true crime began. It began badly. It would not improve quickly. The 911 call Patsy Ramsey placed on the morning of December 26th lasted just over 2 minutes. In the recording, analyzed exhaustively over the years by investigators, journalists, and audio experts, her distress arrives immediately. She is panicked. She is asking for help. She tells the dispatcher her daughter has been kidnapped. She mentions the ransom note, and then the call ends before the dispatcher has finished asking questions. That detail, the abrupt disconnection, the call ending before it should have, became one of dozens of small moments in this case that people would spend years examining from every possible direction. Boulder police responded quickly. Officers arrived at the house, and almost from that first moment, the investigation began making decisions that would later be acknowledged as mistakes. Friends and family members were allowed inside the house. The scene was not properly secured. People moved through the space, touched surfaces, occupied the rooms where a crime had taken place in the preceding hours. The ransom note, 3 handwritten pages, arguably the single most significant piece of physical evidence at the scene, was handled without anywhere near the care a document of that kind required. That note was its own kind of mystery. Ransom notes in genuine kidnapping cases tend to be short, blunt. They communicated demand and nothing more. This one was the opposite. It was long, unusually, almost strangely long for its stated purpose. It felt personal in places, theatrical in others. It named John Ramsey specifically. The dollar amount it demanded was oddly precise. Investigators and linguistic analysts who later studied it described a document that seemed to have been written by someone with intimate knowledge of the family, or by someone working very hard to create that impression. The paper it was written on, and the pen used to write it, were both found inside the Ramsey home. That detail, too, would cast a long shadow. The day moved forward. The ransom deadline came and passed. No call arrived. No exchange was arranged. Late in the afternoon, when an investigator asked John Ramsey to go through the house and look for anything out of the ordinary, Ramsey and a family friend went to the basement. In a small, windowless room, a space the family used for storage and referred to as the wine cellar, they found JonBenét's body. She had been there all day. The child everyone believed had been taken was still inside her own home. She had never left. John Ramsey carried her upstairs himself. A father's instinct in a moment of unbearable grief. Also, from an investigative standpoint, another irreversible compromise of the scene. By nightfall on December 26th, the investigation into JonBenét Ramsey's murder was already damaged in ways that would take years to fully trace. The autopsy was conducted by Boulder County Coroner John Meyer. What it revealed was devastating in its precision. JonBenét had died from a combination of asphyxiation due to strangulation and a severe blow to the head. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. She had been struck on the right side of her skull, a blow with enough force to fracture bone and cause significant brain hemorrhaging. She had also been strangled with a ligature, a cord looped around her neck and fastened to a small wooden handle that investigators referred to as a garrote. The injuries described something sustained, something deliberate, something that spoke to an act of violence against a 6-year-old child. That is almost impossible to hold in the mind for very long. And the forensic picture pointed somewhere specific. JonBenét had not been taken from the house. She had been killed inside it. That finding, layered on top of the fact that there was no clear evidence of forced entry, and that the ransom note had been composed using materials found within the home itself, drew investigative attention inward, not toward any confirmed person, but toward the house, and toward the people who had been in it. There was also DNA. A small quantity of genetic material from an unidentified male was found in JonBenét's underwear, and later on her long underwear. It did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. It did not match anyone in any available database. It was a thread. 2 years later, in 2008, Boulder County District Attorney Mary Lacey sent a formal letter to the Ramsey family. It stated that new DNA analysis, a more sophisticated form of testing than had been available in 1996, had found genetic material from an unknown male on multiple items of JonBenét's clothing. The results, the letter stated, excluded the Ramseys as potential contributors of that DNA. A formal apology was offered for the years of suspicion the family had endured. It was received, depending on who you ask, as either a long overdue acknowledgement or an incomplete one. The DNA still had no match. The case was still open, and JonBenét was still waiting. The unidentified DNA has come to represent something larger than itself in this case. It is the piece of evidence that changes the picture depending on how you examine it, and the piece that forensic science has continued to circle back toward as the technology to analyze it has grown more powerful. The DNA profile was developed through touch DNA analysis, a technique that extracts genetic material from trace skin cells left behind by physical contact. When applied to JonBenét's clothing, the results were consistent. The same unknown male profile appeared across multiple locations. According to investigators, it was found in her underwear and on her long johns. That consistency, the same profile in more than one place, was considered significant by analysts. It was not a profile that could be easily attributed to random contamination. The intruder theory that someone unknown to the family entered the home on Christmas night and committed this crime has always had real evidentiary complications to contend with. The absence of obvious forced entry, the ransom note written on materials from inside the house, the note's apparent familiarity with John Ramsey's finances. Those complications are genuine, and they have never been resolved. But the DNA consistent, unmatched, present on the body of the victim is also a genuine evidentiary reality. It belongs to someone. It arrived there through some means, and that someone has never been identified. Investigators, working with forensic genealogy, the same technique used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, began exploring whether the Ramsey DNA profile could be subjected to similar analysis. Forensic genealogy works by uploading an unknown DNA profile to publicly available genealogy databases and then tracing familial connections outward through relatives who have submitted their own DNA voluntarily. It has closed cases that conventional methods could not touch. Whether it will ultimately yield an answer in JonBenét's case remains to be seen, but the possibility, for the first time in a long time, feels real rather than theoretical. What the evidence, taken together, makes clear, and this requires careful language, because no official conclusion has been reached and no person has been charged, is that an individual left DNA on JonBenét Ramsey's body whose identity has never been established and who has never been brought before any court of law. That is a documented fact. What it means and where it leads is where the investigation continues. There is a specific kind of grief that belongs to cases like this one. Not the grief of knowing, which is its own kind of devastation, but at least has a shape, a weight you can learn to carry. This is the grief of not knowing, of a question that cannot be set down and cannot be answered, of a case that demands resolution and has never received it. JonBenét Ramsey's case has become one of the most enduring examples of that particular grief, not just for the family that lived through it, but for the much larger public that has followed it, in one form or another, for nearly 30 years. What the investigation has established. After all of that time and all of that effort, JonBenét was killed inside her own home. On the night of December 25, 1996, she sustained severe injuries. DNA from an unknown male was recovered from her person. No one has been charged. No one has been convicted. The case remains officially open. What it has not established, what has remained the subject of genuine, ongoing debate among forensic experts and legal analysts and investigators who have devoted years to this case, is the identity of the person who killed her. Theories have come and gone. Some have pointed toward the family, some toward an unknown intruder. Some have tried to reconcile the DNA evidence with the other physical evidence in ways that point somewhere specific, without arriving at a conclusion. None of them have been confirmed. And there are the questions that live at the edges of this case, the ones that are harder to ask and harder still to answer, about what the pageant world meant for JonBenét's visibility and her vulnerability, about what it means when a child becomes, in some sense, a public figure before she is old enough to understand what that means, about how her image was used and reused in media coverage that sometimes felt less like mourning and more like consumption, about the systems, investigative, legal, journalistic, that surrounded this case and at times seemed to generate more noise than light. None of those questions resolve easily. Some of them don't resolve at all, but they are part of what this case has become, not just a criminal investigation, but a long, unfinished reckoning with how we treat the children we lose, and how we talk about them, and who we hold responsible for getting it right. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She had everything ahead of her. She had that smile that photographs couldn't quite capture. She deserved better from the night she died, and from the investigation that followed, and from the 3 decades of coverage that came after that. The case is still open. The DNA is still unmatched, and somewhere, in a database, in a family tree, in the memory of someone who has been quiet for a very long time, the answer still exists. Nearly 30 years. That number carries its own kind of weight when you sit with it. A mother found a ransom note on her stairs the morning after Christmas, and a family's world ended in a single hour. And in the time since then, 30 years of headlines and theories, of false confessions and failed prosecutions, of a little girl's face on magazine covers and documentary, thumbnails and cable news graphics. The person responsible has never been held to account. There is something genuinely uncomfortable about that duration, about the fact that a child can be murdered inside her own home, that forensic evidence can be collected, that a full-scale investigation can be launched, and that the person responsible can remain, after all that time and all that effort, unidentified. It troubles something deep in us, something that needs to believe that justice is eventual, even when it isn't immediate, that truth finds its way to the surface, even when it takes time, that no case of this size and this weight simply stays unresolved forever. And yet, here we are. JonBenét's case asks us to hold something that is very difficult to hold. The possibility that some things remain unsolved, not because we haven't tried, but because trying is not always sufficient, because evidence gets contaminated, because investigations get pulled in wrong directions, because the people who are most responsible for what happened are sometimes very good at staying invisible, because the systems we rely on to find the truth were built by people, and people fail in ways that have real and permanent consequences for other people. The family she left behind has lived inside that unresolved space for almost 30 years. Jon Ramsey has spoken publicly over the years about a grief that has never lifted, about the weight of public scrutiny on top of private loss, about the questions that follow him still. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old when his sister died, and he has had to carry the shape of this case his entire adult life, largely without having asked for it. The people who were closest to JonBenét have never had what solving this case might have given them. Not justice, not answers, not the particular, fragile peace that comes from finally knowing. What forensic genealogy and increasingly sophisticated DNA analysis offer is not a promise. They are a possibility. The possibility that the unknown male whose genetic material was found on JonBenét's clothing can finally be traced, that the thread which has existed for nearly 30 years can be followed, at last, to something real, that a case which has come to define unsolved American crime for an entire generation can finally, slowly, move toward something that resembles accountability. No official conclusion has been reached. The investigation is ongoing. The questions that have surrounded this case for decades remain unanswered, but they are being asked again, with better science, with newer tools, and with the insistence that a 6-year-old child deserves to have her story end with the truth, rather than with the silence that has surrounded it for so long. JonBenét Ramsey deserved a long life. She deserved to grow up, to be ordinary, to be unknown in the best possible way. She deserved the future that was taken from her on the night of December 25, 1996. The least the rest of us can do is keep looking. If this story has stayed with you, take a moment with that. Cases like JonBenét's have a way of asking something of the people who follow them. Not just attention, but a willingness to sit with difficult questions about justice and truth, and what we owe to children who are lost. If you have thoughts on what you've heard, something in this case that has always stayed with you, or a question that never quite got answered, bring it to the comments. Those conversations matter. And if this kind of storytelling, careful, human, unhurried, means something to you, consider